All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on FDA regulations presented by Foresight Senior Consultant, Dr. David McClure. Over the last 20 years, David McClure has focused most of his professional efforts on developing health-related products regulated by the U.S. FDA and similar foreign regulatory agencies and bringing those products to market. David has led product development, manufacturing, regulatory, and business development efforts for firms creating and/or manufacturing drugs, medical devices, medical foods, and cosmetic products. David has also served as Chief Patent Counsel for a pharmaceutical company, Director of Regulatory Affairs for a pharmaceutical and medical device company, and General Counsel for human and veterinary healthcare products companies. David is a registered patent attorney practicing since 1998 and also holds the RAC certificate from the Regulatory Affairs Certification Board and regularly represents companies before FDA in matters related to market access and regulatory compliance. Now, before we get started today, I'd like to ask that everyone please keep their microphones muted. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat box and we will be sure to answer them during the Q&A session at the end. If we don't get to any of your questions, David will answer those offline as well. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, David.
Thank you, Elisa, and welcome everyone to this afternoon's webinar on FDA regulation. I wanted to connect initially what we do at Foresight, which is guiding innovations to market, with what you as technology developers do and what FDA does. So in the words of our founder, Phil Spesser, in technology transfer, the goods being sold are intellectual property. That is, ideas that have been reduced to an embodied format and that can be legally protected. So the coercive power of the state can be used to punish any party breaking the deal. And by analogy, let's look at what is done by FDA with respect to the products that it regulates. In FDA regulation, the goods being regulated are health-related products, such as foods, drugs, cosmetics, medical devices, tobacco products, and so on, that might cause harm to their users, such as children, adults, nurse practitioners, and so forth, or to non-users. So the coercive power of the state can be used to punish any party breaking the social contract. And by the social contract, I mean basically here that we will not do things that needlessly harm others. So to be simple, FDA imposes regulatory barriers to market entry to protect the public health. So why does FDA exist? Yes, FDA exists to impose barriers to market entry to protect the public health. Consumers and other end users of FDA-regulated products are at an informational disadvantage with respect to the designers and manufacturers of those products. In other words, the information is much greater on the side of those who designed or manufactured the product, and the public needs to be protected. How does FDA protect the public? Impose barriers to market entry. So by imposing barriers to market entry, FDA seeks to ensure that only those products that are not needlessly harmful enter and remain in the market. Now, if you're engaged in technology commercialization, you might ask why you should care about FDA. One reason you should care is that not all FDA-imposed barriers to market entry are the same. So it's important to be able to assess a technology and determine, to a first approximation, the regulatory barrier to market entry, not only for an innovator product such as you may be developing, but also for current and prospective competitors. FDA regulation will determine through its own action what may be lawfully said about a product. In other words, FDA regulation will impact how the value proposition is articulated and communicated to end users and other customers in the distribution chain, and which customers and channels of distribution may be accessed. And pausing here, those of you who use business model canvas will recognize this as basically the right side of the canvas. You need to be able to communicate your value proposition to your customers and through your channels, and FDA regulation will impact how you can do that. FDA regulation will also determine, as a practical matter, the expected cost of getting a product to market and keeping it there. thereby indirectly determining the activities, resources, and partners that are required to attain and maintain market access. And again, with reference to the business model canvas, you see that's the left side of the business model canvas. How are you going to recruit others to help you get to market, and what are you going to do to get there? FDA regulation may even determine whether a market entrant enjoys a limited term of exclusivity, that is a monopoly, for the marketing of a regulated product, thereby impacting expected revenue. And again, we're trained to think of exclusivity as simply an intellectual property matter, but as it happens, FDA can impact whether a current market participant or future entrants might enjoy a period of exclusivity. What are some practical questions that FDA actually addresses through its regulation? First and foremost, and this is how those of us who are part of Foresight, how we were trained by Phil years ago, how will the end user use your product? In other words, how does that product interface with the user? Where will the product be used? Is it in a hospital, a clinic, at home? And will a learned intermediary, a healthcare provider, administer or prescribe the product? Each of these bears upon the intended use of the product, which is an enormously important concept to FDA, which determines a great deal of FDA regulation. Further, what health condition will prompt use of your product? In other words, what's the target population for the use of your product? That bears upon what FDA regards as indications for use. And as a technology developer, you're acutely aware of what features your product must possess in order for it to attain commercial success. These in FDA lexicon may be called, for instance, technological characteristics, and we'll return to a discussion of those later. And again, what must you say about your product in order for it to attain commercial success? This bears upon the labeling of the product, and we'll go in depth about that in a little bit, promotion and advertising of the product. Importantly, what barriers to entry would you like to set up to keep out your competitors? There may or may not be a mechanism within FDA regulation to permit you to do that, bearing upon exclusivity. Also, what barriers to entry lie ahead of you to get your product on the market and keep it there? And this bears upon many FDA activities, the review of applications, clearance or approval of products for marketing, exclusivities awarded to your competitors, the registration of your establishment and listing of your products, and adherence to good manufacturing practices once you're actually making a product. Now, many of you may be at a very early stage, not manufacturing product yet, but the foreseen costs of adhering to good manufacturing practices determines to some degree the net present value of your technology. Also, what further activities must you engage in to keep your product on the market? And again, in certain circumstances, a technology developer that has a product approved or cleared must make commitments to FDA to keep an eye on what's going on with the product in the marketplace so that adverse events are reported, for instance, to FDA. And certainly there's an ongoing duty to handle complaints from consumers, to engage in corrective and preventive action in order to address any issues that are raised, and again, continue to be compliant with respect to manufacturing, with respect to labeling, with respect to how a product is promoted. In short, FDA requirements can impact every stage of the product life cycle. Okay, who is FDA? Formal name, the United States Food and Drug Administration, named as such in 1930, tracing its origins back to 1906. There are about 16,000 employees with over a $5 billion annual budget. FDA is part of the Department of Health and Human Services, and it's certainly the flagship consumer protection agency of the United States government, and perhaps the best known consumer protection agency in the world. And where is FDA? By now, most headquarters operations have been consolidated at the White Oak campus which was the former Naval Ordnance Laboratory in Silver Spring, Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C. In this photo, in the bottom of the slide, you see New Hampshire Avenue there at the bottom of the photo. We're facing basically east-northeast. So the campus has been filled up. A great deal of construction gone on there in the last 10 to 15 years, but most operations for headquarters are now consolidated there. And of course, there are also field offices around the United States and abroad for conducting inspections and making sure that on-the-ground policy is implemented properly. Okay, what does FDA regulate? As with the first word in the title, foods. Foods, dietary supplements, cosmetics, and other related products. They are regulated through the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, or CFSN, at FDA. Drugs, and we'll talk a bit about drugs later, they're regulated to a great extent by the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or CDER, at FDA. Biologics, including vaccines and blood products, by the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, or CBER, at FDA. Medical devices and other radiation-emitting products, regulated by the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, or CDRH, at FDA. Animal drug products, food and feed, regulated by the Center for Veterinary Medicine, or CVM, at FDA. And very recently now, tobacco products for the last several years by the Center for Tobacco Products, or CTP, at FDA. Now, in addition to these sort of relatively clean categories of products, there are as well combination products that are regulated by FDA, and we'll talk about those later in the presentation. And those, of course, incorporate two or more of the categories that are otherwise regulated by FDA. And as far as the economic impact of the market for FDA-regulated products, their sales annually are over $1 trillion. So when do you need to think about FDA? And if your category falls into the slide or is even near it, you should start thinking about FDA immediately and all the way through your product development process and even throughout the time your product is on the market. And why is this? You need to determine the regulatory status possibilities, there may be more than one, as early as possible in the product development process in order to define and clarify your strategic alternatives. And as with all other business decisions, the competitive and resource allocation considerations will finally bear upon the choice of path to market to generate the ROI that you will need to generate to satisfy your own stakeholders. Okay, so how does FDA do this? How do they regulate products? Okay, well, we as the citizens of the United States, we actually confer to Congress the authority to act, and Congress has conferred to FDA the authority to act. And so the FDA was established through the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which still governs its activities. But in order to engage in those activities, FDA has to promulgate a series of regulations to make this actually take place. So many of those regulations are as good as a statute in having the force of law, meaning that if you violate those regulations, it may be a federal crime. So FDA regulations are to be adhered to and paid attention to. There's a complexity there, though, that under the Administrative Procedure Act, most FDA regulations have to be promulgated provisionally and then await a period of comment from the public before being made final. So you might imagine this makes it difficult to continue to evolve proper regulations over the course of time. FDA manages, but it's very, very busy. So how does FDA communicate its expectations as a practical matter when it takes a while, it takes a long time to change a statute, and it takes quite a while to promulgate and finalize regulations? Well, the way FDA does this is through issuing guidance documents. And guidance documents contain, I wouldn't want to call it advice, but basically FDA calls it its current thinking I call it also FDA's expectations concerning a wide variety of products and regulatory issues. And guidance documents are the practical handbook with respect to how to get things done in most instances. As well, FDA subjects manufacturers and others in the supply chain to periodic inspection and requires them to register their establishments with FDA and list their products. FDA reviews not only those registrations and product listings, but of course also pre-market applications for product clearance or approval and post-market reports. And finally, when it's clear to FDA that the law is being violated, FDA can refer a matter to the Department of Justice for so-called enforcement action. Okay, a very important term of art in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is labeling. And labeling, if you think of the word, it conjures up a picture of just a label placed on a product. But it's far more than that. Directly from the statute here, labeling means all labels and other written, printed, or graphic matter upon an article or any of its containers or wrappers or accompanying such article. And with regard to subpart N there, the important point there is to note that if the labeling does not reveal facts that are material to other representations made with respect to the consequences of using a product, the labeling may be deficient. So that is why when you hear a drug commercial, you might hear about the features and the benefits of the drug for a certain amount of time and a great deal about the potential downside of using the drug. So that labeling is regulated so that it conveys not just the benefits, but the risks of using a product. If there's a take-home message for today's presentation, I hope you'll remember, above all else, FDA regulates products according to their intended use. To a certain extent, FDA regulates products according to their technological characteristics as well, and we'll certainly talk about that in the remainder of the presentation. But intended use is at the top of the list. In the section 801.4 of Part 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, there's a very interesting explanation of what intended uses are. And I'll just quote from it briefly here. Intended uses refer to the objective intent of the persons legally responsible for the labeling of products. And note that it says the objective intent, not the subjective intent. Going on, the reg reads, the intent is determined by such persons' expressions or may be shown by the circumstances surrounding the distribution of the product. This objective intent may, for example, be shown by labeling claims, advertising matter, or oral or written statements by such persons or their representatives. It may be shown by the circumstances that the product is, with the knowledge of such persons or their representatives, offered and used for a purpose for which it is neither labeled nor advertised. And the regulation goes on. But the important point here is that intended use is determined by the labeling and by the circumstances in which a product is actually used. Not what a technology developer thinks, but rather those hard and fast circumstances and what's in the labeling. Okay, what is a drug according to FDA? In the statute itself, a drug is an article intended for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, or intended to affect the structure or any function of the body. And you might think that's an awfully broad definition, and it is. So if you had only that definition, an MRI device would actually be, when used for diagnosis of disease, a drug. And we all know that an MRI is not a drug, so how is that managed in the statute? Well, the statute expanded. And articles intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, or intended to affect the structure or function of the body which do not achieve their primary intended purposes through chemical action or which are not dependent upon being metabolized are reckoned to be medical devices. So although the definition of drug, as you saw, quite broad, the definition of medical device is that which does not act chemically in general or does not need to be metabolized. As well, in the statute, there's now a definition of biological product or biologic, and there's, again, a sort of incomplete laundry list there of things that might be biologics: virus, therapeutic serum, toxin, antitoxin, vaccine, blood component or derivative, allergenic product, protein, and so forth, applicable to the prevention, treatment, or cure of a disease or condition. And the language is a little bit different from those for medical devices and drugs because there's a historical difference in the development of biologics. This is actually from the Public Health Service Act rather than the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So there are historical reasons for a slightly different regulation of biologics from that of drugs and devices, but there's a great deal of convergence by this point. Now, we're frequently asked, what's a combination product and how is it regulated? So, as the name implies, a product comprised of two or more regulated components, that is, drug device, biologic device, drug biologic, or drug device and biologic, all three, that are combined or packaged together. So that would be a combination product pursuant to the reg. Okay, something everyone needs to be thinking about if you're developing a drug or a biologic: what is the path to market? And at a high level, what the technology developer must do is ultimately show the product to be safe and effective through adequate and well-controlled studies. Now, how has that begun? That has begun through an investigational new drug application, and there are various kinds of INDs: emergency use, treatment, investigator INDs. There are various categories of INDs, commercial and research, but bottom line is, for every IND, you have to show that you're adequately protecting human subjects. And how is that done as a practical matter? There's a fair bit of pharmacology and toxicology presented to the agency in an IND. There's information on the manufacturing and control of the manufacturing to make sure that the substance that's going to be administered is appropriate for human use. And then very, very importantly, there's information regarding the clinical study that's going to be undertaken, the detailed protocol of the study, the qualifications of the clinical investigators, and even a copy of the informed consent form to show that there is truly informed consent on the part of the subjects who will be participating in the study. Now, as a practical matter, years after that, when finally all clinical studies have been completed, marketing approval must be sought pursuant to a new drug application, or NDA, and that's what's reviewed by CDER, or a biologics license application, or BLA, which is reviewed by CDER and CBER both. And again, what we hear about typically is a canonical phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 of development. That is typically the case, but there's also flexibility in what FDA does. And an example that comes to mind is an antivenom for scorpion stings that was approved in 2011 on the basis of data from 15 clinical subjects. So it's not always the case that you have to have a very rigorous trial in order to gain approval. The path to market for medical devices is somewhat different. The path to market for devices depends on the risk level, and highest risk devices are class 3 devices such as an artificial heart, and for those, pre-market approval is generally required. So in that way, they're kind of like drugs. Intermediate risk devices are class 2 devices. Pregnancy test would be an example of that. And in general, pre-market notification, not approval, is generally required. And then finally, the lowest risk class of devices, class 1, there's no general requirement for pre-market notification. Now, keeping in mind those classifications, there are also exceptions and nuances. So it's really important to evaluate each product on its own and determine its likely classification and status. And so, for instance, in the regulations, some Class II devices are said to be exempt from pre-market notification requirements. And I go through this a lot with those I work with. Those of you who develop technologies, you are in the process of differentiating the products you're developing from those that are already out there, those that you envision others are going to develop. There are features and benefits that your product might confer that others don't. But you have to keep in mind, if you're developing an exempt device, if it has a different intended use or different technological characteristics from a generic device, it may lose its exemption. And that's kind of painful, but that's the reality. And so that's why you see many pre-market notification or 510K applications being filed for devices that would appear on the surface not to have to, but either their technological characteristics or how the developer wants to promote them militate towards going ahead and filing a 510K. And we'll talk about 510Ks here presently. Okay, those of you who are developing devices are familiar with the 510K. It's the most common path for innovative devices to get to market. And so what's a 510K? It's an application in which the product developer seeks to substantiate that their innovative device, or the subject device, is substantially equivalent to one or more lawfully marketed predicate devices on the basis of the substantial equivalence of the intended use and the technological characteristics of the subject device to the intended use and the technological characteristics of the predicate devices. And so once that application is submitted, CDRH either determines that there is substantial equivalence and clears the subject device, not approves it, clears it to be marketed, or determines that the subject device is not substantially equivalent to the predicate device. So what happens if there's an NSE determination? It's not the end of the world. You either sort of step up and file a pre-market approval application as if this is a riskier device, or in the alternative, you can seek a de novo classification of the device. And that means an entirely new regulation will be promulgated just to cover your new device and other future devices having the same intended use and technological characteristics. And so you can imagine the barrier to competitor entry if you file a 510K and get clearance or have a de novo petition granted. It's not as high a barrier to competitor entry as a pre-market approval application would create. What a pre-market approval application requires is clinical data, preclinical data, and in many respects it's analogous to a new drug application. But the good news is if you get a PMA approved, it makes it harder for competitors to enter the market. As opposed to 510K applications, depending on the risk profile of the device, there may not be a requirement for clinical data at all. That is how a PMA typically differs from a 510K. Okay, with respect to combination products, about 14 years ago, the Office of Combination Products was created because more and more combination products were coming to market. And so what the Office of Combination Products does is issue classification and jurisdiction assignments for proposed products. The classification determines what type of product it is. Is it a drug? Is it a device? Is it a biologic? Or is it a combination product? And then a determination is made as well of jurisdiction. Which center will regulate the product, or which will be the lead center if there are going to be multiple centers involved? And so what technology developers can do is submit a request for designation, and it's very important here when you send in a request for designation and you get a response, you need to abide by the information you get from FDA. You can't just disregard it. And that's what I tell those I work with frequently. If you ask FDA a question, you need to be prepared for an answer that you don't want, and you need to abide by that answer. Okay, so a request for designation is just one example of the many kinds of pre-market communications that may take place with FDA. Product developers may request a pre-submission meeting with the relevant center to discuss aspects of a product's non-clinical or clinical development. And I'll pause here and say this is critically important because the best information is there in White Oak. You need to go get that information. And sometimes if the guidance documents don't give you the answer, it's not in the regs, it's not in the statute, you need to talk to those who are going to determine your fate. So for instance, you've heard about pre-IND meetings. If you're a drug or biologics developer, a pre-IND meeting may be sought in which an overall plan for clinical development, such as tox or animal model selection, or clinical development, how are you going to conduct your clinicals, which study subject population you'll play into, what's the design going to be. You can discuss that with CDER and CBER staff and get answers to your questions. Similarly, on the device side, you may seek a meeting in which the appropriateness of your predicates, if you're going to be preparing a 510K, will be discussed. And again, you can get answers at these meetings. After the meetings, you submit minutes. It's in the permanent record. You and the reviewers can both refer back to those minutes to know what was discussed. Because I want to talk a little bit about exclusivity today, I want to talk a tiny bit about orphan products, because those I work with, again, often ask about orphan products, whether it's a good or bad. And I hear from time to time, well, we don't want to work on an orphan indication because it's too small. But as those of you who work in the field may well know, about half the approvals now are for orphan indications. And as you see at the bottom bullet there, rituximab is a $7 billion a year product that began as an orphan product. So what's an orphan indication? It's basically if there's a prevalence of 200,000 or less in the US at a given point in time. And in order to get an orphan designation, you need to work with the Office of Orphan Products Development, or OOPD, at FDA, and OOPD staff are charged with helping technology developers, and they engage in a great deal of informal consultation prior to applications being filed. One, I think, piece of misinformation out there is that if you're working on an orphan designation, you might actually get approval faster, and that's not in general the case. OOPD personnel help in the preparation for meetings where your product will be discussed, but is not a fast track to market. Okay, periods of exclusivity that FDA can confer. Orphan drug exclusivity, 7 years. If you're a new chemical entity, 5 years. Various other kinds of exclusivity. And keep in mind, this is separate and apart from patent exclusivity. So there are ways to get a limited monopoly by working with FDA, and you just have to follow the rules. And also, thanks to the ACA, now biologics developers can look forward to a 12-year term of exclusivity before any biosimilars can be approved. So again, the whole system is set up at the highest level to protect the public. But what we want to do is continue to incentivize innovation. So even FDA, not just the Patent Office, offers these incentives thanks to Congress's prompting them to do so for various technology developers. Reputed fast ways to get products to market are listed on this slide. And I say reputed because for most of us, the effects of these fast tracks are way in the future. We may be at a very early stage of development. So fast track, breakthrough therapy, accelerated approval, priority review, each of those can allow an application to be acted upon faster or a product to get to market faster. But as I tell those I work with, don't count on it. You don't know in advance. Those mechanisms are there. You may want to make use of them, but again, don't count your chickens before they're hatched. I want to briefly look at a few case studies just to see how to connect regulatory status with the real world. And something that's been in the press a lot lately, Epipen. And you've probably heard, oh my goodness, Epipen was being sold for many, I think hundreds of dollars per unit. What's that about? So this is a simple description and a photo of the Epipen there. Well, as it turns out, before the Office of Combination Products existed, the Epipen was approved under a new drug application well, now close to 30 years ago. And if you go to the FDA's website, which again is a wonderful source of competitive intelligence if you work in these industries, you see that approval took place in '87, and it's stated directly there are no therapeutic equivalents. So it's kind of hard to know how you would come up with something like the Epipen if it's stated so distinctly there. Moreover, if you look at the code, the therapeutic equivalence code assigned to the Epipen, BX is for products where the data are insufficient to determine therapeutic equivalence. So as this discussion today has indicated, barriers to entry are all that FDA is about. And those who developed the Epipen have enjoyed having put up a very large barrier to competitor entry. An example here of a device that was cleared under a 510K is this physiological patient monitor. And again, this is not an endorsement of the product, it's just one that came to mind. And you see here the 510K number, the device name, who the applicant is, the regulation number, and that's kind of important again for competitive intelligence purposes. You see that the regulation is 870.2300, that's for cardiac monitors, and you see if you go there, a cardiac monitor is a device used to measure the heart rate from an analog signal produced by an ECG, vector cardiograph, or blood pressure monitor. So you see this is, you might say, a little bit more advanced possibly than a typical monitor. And if you go to the indications for use for the product, it mentions that the product is intended for use by clinicians and medically qualified personnel for single or multi-parameter vital signs monitoring of adult patients. And I'll just pause there and say, okay, one way that this across to FDA that this risk is going to be managed is it's going to be used by clinicians and on adults only. They go on to say it's used in hospital-based facilities, including medical intermediate care floors and emergency departments. So there are ways that the applicants can signal to FDA that we're going to manage the risk by placing the product only in the hands of those who know how to use it. And you see the date received and decision date there. This application for 510K clearance was approved in very, very short time. It was deemed to be substantially equivalent. It went before the cardiovascular panel and was not a combination product. An example of a vaccine, again, very recent approval letter from last week, this quadrivalent influenza vaccine from Protein Sciences. And again, you see the indication here for active immunization against disease caused by influenza virus, subtypes A and B contained in the vaccine. It's approved for use in persons 18 years of age and older. Again, you'll see time and again going to FDA's website, taking a look at competitor products. It's always on FDA's mind to make a risk-benefit determination. So you must show FDA you're properly managing risk. One way to do that is to limit your patient population for its indication to adults or those who are being administered a drug or device by a learned intermediary. Finally, a PMA approved or pre-market approval approved product, the Cologuard, which, as you see here, is intended for the qualitative detection of colorectal neoplasia-associated DNA markers and for the presence of occult hemoglobin in human stool. So basically, the intended use of this product is as an aid or adjunct to other means of detection, of course, colonoscopy being the gold standard. But the PMA was approved on the basis that the benefit justified the risk, and the risk of false negatives and false positives would be adequately managed. And this, as I understand, this product is being reimbursed these days and has been, I don't know about its financial success, but at least in terms of gaining reimbursement has been successful. A brief word about regulatory agencies elsewhere. In Europe, there's EMA. In Japan, PMDA. In China, SFDA, and then in this hemisphere, Health Canada, COFEPRIS, and Anvisa. And if you want a comprehensive list of those regulatory agencies, they're to be found at that website. So in conclusion, early and often define FDA requirements and the opportunities, because that is critically important to your commercialization process. Also, don't be afraid to ask for a meeting with FDA if you have a question about your product development path, including especially your clinical or non-clinical studies. Use the FDA website to understand what the agency expects that you see typically in guidance documents, and to gain competitive intelligence on what your prospective competitors or actual competitors are doing. Finally, think about what FDA can do for you. They give you a roadmap to get your innovative product to market. Yes, it's going to cost you, while possibly giving the opportunity to create barriers to entry to your competitors. I'd now be happy to field questions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, David. We do have a couple questions that came in while we were talking here. So the first one is, where can I find the guidance documents that you mentioned? And this was earlier on.
What I do typically if I'm in a hurry, I just Google guidance documents, fda.gov, and there is a list. If I were better at manipulating my screen while answering a question, I'd show you right now. But if that's a question, my next slide, I'll just put it up there as my contact. If anybody has any trouble finding the guidance documents, call me, text me, or email me.
Okay, perfect. If there is a special control document for a certain medical device from 10 years ago, do I need to follow that to the letter?
Well, has it been obsoleted since then? That's the question. I would say it's good to follow it. Do you have to follow it to the letter? I would say do your best.
Okay.
And again, if there's a specific question about that someone would like to ask, I'm happy to address it offline.
Great. For a medical device, do the reviewers like longitudinal studies or prospective studies?
It depends. It depends on the intended use of the device. So if the intended use of the device is something that's going to be implanted and used in a subject or in a patient for years, I would think that there might be good reason to conduct a longitudinal study. If something's going to be used at a single point in time for a few seconds, probably doesn't make sense. So again, a good question depends on the circumstances. There's no overt requirement always to have longitudinal data. So again, if there's a specific question somebody would like to run by me on that, I'm happy to address it.
Okay, excellent. If my medical device uses a different analyte but has the same intended use, a predicate device already approved for 510K, is that a de novo or can I use a traditional 510K?
The shorter answer, I don't know. I mean, the Analyte part, I would want to know a little bit more about, but I will say this. In my dealings with FDA, if you go to FDA's website, they'll tell you that you can apply de novo without going through a 510K. But what FDA will tell you in person is nobody really does that. And they really prefer if you go through a 510K first and get an NSC determination. So my advice would be go ahead and try the 510K because that's what FDA prefers, and you have to present the same data either way. There's not a whole lot of downside to it, and to me the downside as a practical matter is you lose time, and your stakeholders don't want you to lose time. But I'm telling you, in person, FDA says we don't really like or want ab initio de novos. We just want to deal with them once we've made an NSA determination.
Okay, excellent. How much does a de novo and PMA cost for a medical device with legal fees?
There's no good answer to that question. I'd say it's never going to cost less than thousands of dollars, but what the upper limit is for something like the Abiacar heart or something like that, it's probably a whole lot of money.
Okay. How similar must products be to be excluded? For example, a mistaken design may be approved and used, but science will find the corrected design. What then?
If science finds the corrected design, then I would suspect that the market will follow science and somebody will update the design and have a product that embodies that design, but maybe I'm missing the point of the question.
Yeah, I think the point of the question was about exclusivity.
Okay. So with respect to exclusivity, okay, so on the device side, what's design is typically thought of in device terms. Then you have a PMA. It depends on the indication and the technology. There's nothing to keep someone else from following on with another artificial heart. But we all know that as a practical matter, it's going to take a lot of resources to do that. But there's not that's what I'm calling de facto rather than de jure exclusivity that FDA confers. On the drug side, the rules are relatively straightforwardly laid out in the guidances and the regs. So I would refer the questioner there if it's on the drug side.
Okay, perfect. David, do you have any thoughts on the Nutraceuticals and FDA regulation?
Yes. Didn't make it into this presentation, but clearly, without talking about, again, nutraceuticals are, in FDA terms, dietary supplements. Clearly, FDA is regulating them by virtue of requiring certain good manufacturing practices, and they take offense when label claims are made that make the products in effect drugs, saying they'll cure or mitigate or treat disease. And you look at warning letters are posted every week on FDA's website. There at least is one every week with respect to a dietary supplement that has made a claim that can't be supported. Having said that, the statute, the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, creates a mechanism by which there can be pre-market notification of structure function claims, and the products can stay lawfully on the market. So I don't have an opinion about that. It is sort of the law, and so there are those abiding by the law and there are those flouting the law, but that's probably the case for other industries as well.
Absolutely. Okay, so I think we're going to cut it off here. I'm going to ask the final question. If anybody else has any additional questions, I know there's a couple more in the chat box here. I will pass on your questions to David at the end, and he can go ahead and email you some answers if he's got any. And of course, you can reach out to him. His contact information is on the screen here. So final question, can adverse events cause revocation of exclusivity rights? If so, is it communicated to competitors that might be able to fill that void?
I've not heard of it happening. I have not looked for that, but I've not heard of it happening.
Okay, well that is it for today. Thank you everyone for your questions, and of course thank you David for the presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and we hope to see you at the next webinar.